Let's jump right into it. I know people are kind of interested of a story that was kind of pretty prevalent earlier this week. Of course, last week in the big recruiting weekend for Nebraska, but kind of what grabbed a lot of people's attention is Dylan Raiola no longer looking like he's coming to the spring game for Nebraska.
Yeah, and I think that, look, that would have been the third visit in 2 months for him because he came in the end of February. It's not a great sign. I mean, I think that we can all kind of agree that's not a good thing to have happen to, obviously, to the staff, to this class, trying to build some momentum to kind of get going into the spring game weekend and carry you through to official visits. But I don't know if I would I don't know if I would seriously hang my hat on that and say Nebraska is out of it by any means. I just think you're going to see more of these things pop up, and you're just not going to know how to read them. And there's not going to be ever an explanation about why things are happening and why things are going about the way that they are. So I think the best thing here is just to relax. I do know that people have noticed that Matt Rule is following a new 2024 quarterback on Twitter, somebody that Coach Satterfield recruited to South Carolina. So that could be another sign that something negative has happened there in the Dylan Raiola sweepstakes. But I honestly kind of feel like just let it relax and let this thing ride out and see if Nebraska gets their official visit in June, because that could be very, very critical to Matt Rule in Nebraska.
That's very interesting. Is this as the primary? I mean, we kind of think about those same four schools usually that Nebraska, that Dylan Raiola kind of had narrowed down. Is it still kind of feel like they're all fighting in there? Or does it feel like Georgia has become the favorite?
It does. Look, I never really felt like, and it's going to sound bad, but I guess I'll take a chance on this. But I've never been really convinced that USC was, like the lead school. Even when things were pointing there a month ago, I wasn't buying it. I've always felt like Georgia has been the school to beat. There's been some things that have kind of happened, things I've kind of heard behind the scenes, things that would just kind of indicate that he has that Dylan has an affinity for Athens, Georgia, and the Bulldogs. I think that was definitely showed that, when he showed up to the national championship game. So I think Georgia has always been the top competition for Raiola. I think that they've strengthened their argument now, and that's kind of unusual, given the fact that they already have a 2024 quarterback in the class. But Dylan's not going to be scared of that or anybody else that's already in the room.
And of course, Dylan was just one part of the big weekend for Nebraska. I know some fans thought that with that big recruiting effort that maybe there would be a commitment. Having spoken to you before, we know that wasn't necessarily an expectation. But what do you think? What do you think the takeaway is from the big recruiting weekend last week?
Yeah, I never thought the terms of success could be measured with the commitments at the end of the weekend. I just didn't feel like those guys are all very highly touted. I mean, if you were going to go back and point your finger at maybe a guy or two that you felt like could jump in the class, it might have been the three guys from Texas. It might have been, Flint, Pyle, and Buford. Those might have been the three guys that had the most likelihood to go ahead and decide to commit. But what you were really shooting for is like a guy like Brandon Baker. You're already seeing the fruits of your labor last weekend and the successes of your labor last weekend coming through, because Brandon Baker has already confirmed, to Chad Simmons with On 3 that he is coming back to Lincoln for the spring game in April. That's the number one offensive tackle in the country. And I think that there's a lot of guys that we're talking about, that weekend for the spring game, like Gerard Smith, Jacob Smith, Elijah Newby, there were Nate Frazier was another guy that was talking about coming back for the spring game. Those are the types of things that you had to kind of measure your success. You've got to come in there and grab these guys and make sure that you've got an ability to kind of get them to come back to campus. You were not going to get them on one unofficial trip from Nebraska or to Nebraska. You've got to bring them back multiple times. And following the spring game, the next thing is you need those guys to come back in June. You need those guys to come back for official visits. I know that some of those guys, particularly the Utah offensive linemen, they're talking about wanting to come back in the fall to come see a game. totally cool with that. You just got to kind of make sure that, as this class kind of gets put together, you've obviously got to pay attention to your priorities and who's at where on the board.
So you were just saying Brandon Baker is coming back for the spring game and the big recruiting weekend and getting those guys to not commit to the university, but commit to at least coming back for another visit and keeping in contact with them. Let's just say, worst case scenario, Nebraska doesn't get Dylan Raiola, but they do end up getting a couple of those bigger name guys that came on that weekend. Would you consider that not a fail, kind of like a failure on Nebraska's part, or kind of something good just to be in the conversation for this long for the number one recruit in the nation?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be viewed that way. I mean, look, I put it into 3 and Out last week. Well, it's kind of this week actually is a summary to the weekend and talking about Raiola, and I think people have to kind of see it that way. I mean, if Dominic's not involved, I mean, is Nebraska still here? Well, probably, there's at least a chance that would be there. But I mean, even as a guy like Dominic and his ties to Nebraska and being a legacy guy, I mean, we just saw Bobby Newcomb's son come off the board, not even visit Nebraska, committed to OU. And obviously Nebraska was very, very interested in seeing him. They went to Arizona in January and stopped by that school. So I think that there are still things in Nebraska that are endearing, whether you're to legacy guys like Raiola or not, like a Brandon Baker. And I think that those are the things that you have to go back now and you have to work to get those guys, to get them on campus. And I think that once you're able to get there, I think that Rule and his staff have shown and have demonstrated that they are putting things together when those guys are on campus. Those recruits are having a fabulous time because it's between the coaching staff, the transparency, their honest approach, the other things that obviously are on campus that all the recruits notice, like facilities and the stadium and such. But then also the Rule and his staff are selling them on Lincoln. I mean, these guys are all coming back saying like they were blown away. Like they didn't think that there would be like that many things and that they wouldn't see that big of a city and that it wouldn't just be it's not just a college town, and how it spills into downtown is so amazing. Rule and his staff have featured that. They have sold that. They are selling that to the players that are coming in, the recruits that are coming in. And I think that that's been like one of the biggest differences so far, is like this way to kind of package everything together. It's not just like facilities and NFL factory and whatever. It's, look, you can come here, you can get your education, you can be in the running to, be the next academic All-American. And oh, by the way, the city of Lincoln is awesome. Let's show you the Haymarket. Let's show you how this kind of spills out here. Let's go to this building top and take a look at over the top of it. And all the kids have just ate it up.
Now, we've seen Georgia do this thing with quarterbacks before, where they take the number one overall quarterback in the class when they got what was his name? Why am I Justin Fields? When they got Justin Fields, and they had, I believe it was Jacob Eason on the roster, and they ended up going with Eason instead of Fields. Fields ends up transferring out. How important is it for Nebraska to, I mean, obviously they'll probably do this, stay in contact with Raiola despite him committing to a different school? Because as you mentioned, Georgia does have another 2024 quarterback already committed on the roster, and he is, I believe, a top 150 recruit.
Yeah, you don't go back and burn bridges just because he decides to go someplace else. You take that supportive, nurturing approach that you can always call me, and you're making this decision. It's going to be the next 4 years for the rest of your life, kind of thing. And do what's best for you. You're making a decision, with the information at hand, and that's all you can be expected to do. And you went about the process right. But give me a call. If you need a hand with something, you can always call and get my opinion on something. I'll help you out any way I possibly can. Those ways of kind of closing the door and closing the file on the 2024 recruiting class keeps everything still open down the line. And the transfer portal requires you to do that. You need, and I've never heard of essentially Nebraska like slamming the door shut and saying, to heck with you then, don't bother calling me back again. I thought we had you in the boat. Like, that's never really been the case. I have heard it happen things have gone ugly, between schools and players, but never with Nebraska before, and I do feel like that will be essentially the kind of that closing off of the 2024 communication, if that's which way it goes.
And it was Jake Fromm. I was wrong. He was a class before Fields.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, he was a class before Fields, and they decided to go with Fromm.
So you're saying you don't expect Matt Rule to pull a Bill Callahan and call Raiola a prima donna if he commits elsewhere?
No. I honestly, I feel like this staff understands that, and I think the previous staff did too. They want the guys to make the right decisions, but I think Rule and his staff have done a great job of selling the school and the city better than other staffs have before in the past. It's not a knock. It's just there's been a way that they have been able to kind of grab that kind of spirit and kind of ingrain it and involve and include it into their visits, into their recruiting program a little bit better. And I got to give props to Matt Rule and his staff.
Another thing that was announced is that Frank Solich will be returning to the spring game. We're talking here with Bryan Munson of Husker Online and On 3. Bryan, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that because it obviously brings up old debates and arguments. And I wanted to ask from you because I think there was at least a perception in folks that I suppose that wanted to see Solich, move on and go ahead and have Nebraska hire a new coach would say that the recruiting wasn't up to the Osborne level. Would you say that at that time? Because I understand that narrative, but I looked at like 2003 defense and they were stacked.
Yeah, and that kind of, it predates me a little bit. I mean, obviously, I was following the Cornhuskers still pretty closely. I had just moved down to Texas about the time that Frank was becoming the head coach, and in all honesty, I don't know necessarily what I would either, what I would kind of my takeaways about why people felt like Solich needed to be replaced. I was at the 0-1 Oklahoma game. And the battle of number 1 versus number 2. And I remember some really good athletes being on that football team. And I do understand, however, the common themes that have kind of been there between Frank and Bo and maybe it's not the way that they were winning the big ones, but it was like the way that they were losing the games, that they should have been a little bit more competitive in. And I think the recruiting aspect probably has come up when it comes to people's knocks of Frank Solich, but I know how critical he was, because I'm friends with still a couple guys that played and played for Frank Solich on those teams in the 90s, and I know Tom was the head coach, but I think they would all be quick to credit, Frank Solich and what he meant to those teams in that run. And I think that's the part there that people need to focus on too, is how important he was to 3 national championships in the 90s.
Yeah. I also thought it was kind of cool, more from what he did at Ohio. It seemed, Nebraska's really blown up. Or I should say, and I don't know if blown up's the right word, but there's a lot more guys getting commits and getting offers at the D1 level. But through a lot of times through Frank's, if you look like at a Nebraska top 10 or top 5 guys going D1, a lot of them would get that shot from Frank in Ohio. Do you expect that to continue with Tim Albin?
No, I think that there was, and the name of the linebackers, it's just escaping me. He was from Kearney, great athlete, went to go play for Frank. Had a great Nike camp at Eugene, just tested off the chart. Never got a Nebraska offer. Went and had a great career at Ohio. I feel like Frank was one of those first coaches that when he got hired on to go someplace else, that really recognized and understood the level of talent there in the state. Now you've got other guys, like Godowski had been doing it for years now. Dan Jackson at Vanderbilt's really trying to, get something going with him down to Vanderbilt, and before that at Northern Illinois and South Dakota State too. That's where Dan Jackson has been, and that's he's been kind of, he links back to a lot of guys in that area. So. I feel like Solich really got the ball rolling and kind of opened the eyes of other institutions when it came to getting into the state and trying to grab talent and lead them out.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I don't know how many people recognize that sort of thing or just kind of understand, Frank Solich's legacy through Nebraska extends beyond his time even at Nebraska. So I think a lot of people are going to be looking forward to him at the spring game. One note real quick. I know we kind of mentioned already Brandon Baker at the spring game. Is this, that's the top offensive lineman in the country. That's absolute huge news. The spring game, I know it's still a long ways. They're going to have a lot more time to get guys in, but do you expect some of those big names other than Brandon Baker's to return as well?
Yeah, you got Brandon Baker. Willis McGahee was going to come back in. I don't know. I don't know what happens if Dylan Raiola is not coming in. I know Willis McGahee, one of the big things he wanted to come back to do was to catch up with Raiola and see how serious he was about, going to Nebraska. One of the guys that we talked about earlier on the show, Gibson Pyle, who was there this weekend, who was also in Nebraska a month ago after he picked up the offer. He will be up there again. I think it's going to be another big sales weekend. I think another thing to kind of keep watching, guys, I think there's been a real lack of 2025 and beyond guys, to come in other than like Stone Saunders, the quarterback from Pennsylvania. I think you're going to start seeing a few more 2025 guys start trickling in here very, very soon. So keep an eye on that as well.
Very, very cool stuff. As usual, we always say always informative, and we always feel a lot smarter once we come out of conversation with Bryan Munson. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll let you back to lunch.
Have a great weekend, guys. We'll talk soon.
All right, you too. There he goes, Bryan Munson of Husker Online and On3.